West Africa is on the edge of a continental upheaval, and it all hinges on one nation's choice. But here's what nobody's talking about. The real battle isn't between countries anymore. It's between two competing visions of what Africa's future should actually look like. Chad is about to make a decision that could shatter one of Africa's longest-standing regional alliances and trigger a domino effect that rewrites the entire geopolitical map of West Africa. For nearly 50 years, ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, has been the institutional anchor of West Africa. Established in 1975, it was supposed to be the engine of regional unity and economic prosperity. The vision was straightforward: 16 nations working together, breaking down trade barriers, solving disputes collectively, and building a prosperous West African bloc that could stand on the world stage as a united force. But something fundamental has broken. Over the past decade, ECOWAS hasn't evolved, it's calcified. Larger economies dominate the decision-making. Bureaucratic inefficiencies paralyze action. And most critically, critics argue it's become less of an African institution and more of a Western proxy, enforcing policies that serve external interests rather than African people. The proof is in the punishments. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger shifted their internal power dynamics and moved away from Western-aligned governments, ECOWAS didn't offer support or understanding. Instead, it imposed devastating sanctions. These weren't surgical strikes on elites. They were economic hammers that devastated ordinary citizens. Trade corridors were closed. Cross-border commerce seized. Families cut off from each other. Economies strangled at the moment they needed flexibility most. The result wasn't stability or redemption. It was deepening inequality, suffering, and a growing sense across the Sahel that ECOWAS was an instrument of external control, not African liberation. And that's where a new force emerged. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, represents something fundamentally different. It's not just another regional bloc. It's an ideological reset. Unlike ECOWAS, which operates within the framework of Western institutional validation, AES was built on a single radical premise: Africa doesn't need permission from anyone else to govern itself. Here's where things get interesting. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger came together to form AES, they weren't just creating a trade agreement. They were articulating a vision of African-led governance, where decisions are made by Africans, for Africans, without external approval. They rejected what they saw as neo-colonial dependency, not crude occupation, but the softer, more insidious control that comes from economic reliance and institutional subordination. AES champions what many across Africa see as non-negotiable: sovereignty over natural resources, control over regional dispute resolution without external mediators, development pathways that prioritize local industries, equitable trade relationships, and sustainable infrastructure built according to African timelines and African needs, not donor schedules or IMF benchmarks. But that's not the full story. What makes AES truly transformative is the partnerships it's opening. Nations aligned with AES are cultivating relationships with non-Western powers, China, Russia, and other emerging economies willing to engage on terms of mutual benefit rather than conditionality. These aren't perfect partners, but they represent something psychologically crucial: the end of the assumption that African development must come through Western institutions. For decades, if you were an African nation seeking investment, infrastructure, or technical assistance, there was essentially one pathway: negotiate with Western powers, accept their conditions, and hope the institutions they controlled, the IMF, the World Bank, donor coordination mechanisms, approved your development model. AES represents a complete rejection of that framework. Now, Chad stands at the absolute center of this transformation. Chad has always been different. Historically, it's been a nation of mediation, a bridge builder in a region fractured by conflict and competition. It shares borders with 5 nations, sits at the crossroads of the Sahel and Central Africa, and has positioned itself for decades as a neutral arbiter in regional disputes rather than as a faction within them. That neutrality has been Chad's defining characteristic. But neutrality in a moment of fundamental realignment is becoming impossible. Here's the tension Chad faces. Remaining in ECOWAS means accepting a system where larger economies like Nigeria and Côte d'Ivoire shape policy, where bureaucratic gridlock is the norm, and where a bloc increasingly seen as compromised by Western influence remains the framework for security and economic cooperation. It means accepting the existing hierarchy of power. But joining AES means something else entirely. It means saying no to that hierarchy. It means committing to a bloc that's explicitly designed to challenge Western institutional dominance. It means diversifying partnership relationships away from traditional Western actors. It means embracing a model of development and governance that centers African agency rather than African accommodation. What happened next changed everything. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formed AES, they didn't just create a new institution. They created a proof of concept. They showed that African nations could break from established blocs and survive. More than survive. They demonstrated that there was an alternative pathway, and that alternative didn't lead to isolation or collapse. It led to new partnerships, new economic possibilities, and most importantly, a restoration of sovereignty that had been partially surrendered to regional and external institutions. That demonstration is now rippling across West Africa. Guinea is watching. Benin is watching. Togo is watching. They're all calculating the same equation. What do we gain by staying? What do we sacrifice by leaving? The gravity of that question is creating a silent realignment happening beneath the surface of official statements and diplomatic platitudes. But there's something larger happening here that touches the very foundation of how Africa relates to the world. The AES model isn't just about trade or security cooperation. It's about reclaiming the narrative of African development. For generations, Africa's story has been written externally, by colonial powers, by Cold War rivals, by international institutions designed in distant capitals. The institutions of those systems were designed when Africa had no say in global affairs. They were built to manage Africa, not to serve it. ECOWAS, even with the best intentions of its founders, was created within that post-colonial framework. It accepted the idea that African problems needed African solutions, but it did so within structures that remained fundamentally influenced by external powers and external logic. It was progress, absolutely, but it was progress within inherited constraints. AES represents a break from those constraints. Chad's decision matters because Chad is not a peripheral player. It's not a small nation that can be overlooked. Chad is strategically positioned, historically respected, and symbolically important. If Chad exits ECOWAS for AES, it's not a minor rearrangement. It's a statement that even nations positioned at the heart of regional consensus are reassessing the value of existing institutions. But that's not the full story. What's truly revolutionary about this moment is what it signals about the speed of institutional change on the African continent. ECOWAS has stood for 50 years. 50 years of relative stability, of institutional continuity, of being the framework within which West African problems were addressed. For it to face serious challenge from a relatively new bloc like AES isn't just a political shift. It's a sign that African nations are losing patience with institutions they perceive as ossified, compromised, or subordinate to external interests. The domino effect could be real. If Chad moves, Senegal becomes the next critical decision point. Senegal is West Africa's democracy model in many eyes: stable governance, respected institutions, cultural influence. If even Senegal begins to seriously evaluate AES, the symbolic weight becomes overwhelming. Côte d'Ivoire, the economic powerhouse of ECOWAS, would face mounting pressure from a completely reshaped coalition. An AES that includes Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and a cluster of other major economies isn't a renegade alliance anymore. It becomes the dominant force in West Africa. This is why Western observers are watching Chad with such intensity. It's not because Chad alone would destabilize ECOWAS. It's because Chad represents the visible manifestation of a deeper shift. African nations are reconsidering whether their interests are actually served by the institutions they inherited, and they're increasingly confident that alternatives exist. This moment transcends economics and security calculations. It's fundamentally about ideology and identity. For decades, African unity meant something specific. Cooperation within frameworks established during the post-colonial period, gradual integration into global markets, and acceptance of institutional arrangements that, while theoretically serving African interests, were often shaped by external powers. That vision produced some genuine achievements: conflict resolution mechanisms, trade frameworks, peaceful border management. These aren't trivial accomplishments. But it also produced frustration. African nations watched their resources extracted by foreign corporations under concession agreements negotiated by previous generations. They watched their development paths dictated by international creditors. They watched their leaders lectured about governance by people who'd never lived under the conditions they were prescribing. And they grew tired. AES embodies a completely different ideology. It says, we don't need permission. We don't need validation from Washington, Brussels, or Beijing, though we'll partner with whoever serves our interests. We don't need institutions designed by people who didn't understand our context. We can design our own. That's a revolutionary statement in the African context. Across the continent, younger generations are embracing this ideology. They didn't live through colonialism. They didn't watch their parents negotiate post-colonial arrangements. They inherited a world where Africa's resources were still being extracted, where African solutions were still being second-guessed, where African agency was still being constrained. To them, institutions like ECOWAS don't represent achievement. They represent the persistence of subordination in a softer form. AES speaks to that generational shift. And here's what's crucial. This isn't a swing from Western influence to Chinese or Russian influence. That's how Western observers often frame it, and it's a profound misreading. What's actually happening is that African nations are claiming the right to have multiple partnerships, to choose relationships based on national interest rather than ideological alignment, to refuse the false choice between Western and non-Western orbits. They're saying, we'll work with whoever benefits us. We'll develop partnerships with China, Russia, the Gulf states, India, each other, not because we've been captured by a rival power, but because we've reclaimed the agency to choose. That's the real revolution. If Chad moves to AES, the consequences ripple outward in multiple directions simultaneously. First, ECOWAS faces an existential question. It can't simply accept the loss of major members and hope to maintain relevance. An ECOWAS diminished to Nigeria, Ghana, and a cluster of smaller nations becomes a sub-regional bloc, not a continental force. That forces reckoning. Either ECOWAS fundamentally reimagines itself, addresses the corruption and inefficiency, genuinely prioritizes African interests, and proves it's not a Western instrument, or it declines into irrelevance. Second, the geopolitical map of Africa shifts in ways that ripple globally. A West African coalition organized around AES principles becomes more integrated with the broader Sahel security and development agenda. It strengthens the voice of continental bodies, like the African Union, in ways that might challenge Western institutional dominance. It opens space for non-Western powers to expand their influence, not through coercion, but through the willingness to engage as partners rather than as patrons. Third, African resource politics change. Right now, the extraction of African minerals, timber, and agricultural products is managed through a framework where Western companies often hold outsized influence, backed by international institutions and Western governments. If AES nations coordinate resource policy more effectively, if they demand better terms, if they develop regional processing capabilities rather than exporting raw materials, the entire global resource economy could experience significant disruption. The implications are staggering. Consider what it means if AES nations successfully build more autonomous development pathways. If they invest in each other rather than relying on Western development banks. If they control their own resource extraction and benefit sharing. If they build regional supply chains that reduce dependence on global markets controlled by others. None of this happens overnight, but the trajectory becomes clear. Africa stops being a subordinate participant in global systems designed elsewhere and becomes an actor shaping systems for itself. But that's not the full story. There are real risks and complexities beneath this narrative of liberation. AES nations still face immense internal challenges: poverty, conflict, underdevelopment. Simply rejecting ECOWAS doesn't solve those problems. Partnership with China, Russia, or others can produce genuine benefits. But it can also introduce new forms of dependency if not carefully managed. The ideology of African self-determination is powerful, but ideology alone doesn't build hospitals or schools or roads. What matters is whether AES can translate ideology into institutions that actually deliver results for ordinary people. What's happening with Chad and ECOWAS isn't an isolated phenomenon. It's part of a broader pattern transforming global power relationships. Across the world, institutions designed in the post-World War II era, designed when the West dominated and others subordinated, are facing legitimacy crises. The World Bank, the IMF, the UN Security Council, regional arrangements like NATO, all of them are being questioned and challenged by nations that no longer accept the assumptions on which those institutions were built. The assumption was, Western nations are responsible for global order, and others should accept the frameworks they establish. That assumption is collapsing, not everywhere at once, and not completely, but unmistakably. AES is West Africa's manifestation of this global shift. It's the statement of nations saying, we're not going to accept frameworks designed when we had no voice. We're going to design our own, and we're going to do it with partners we choose, on terms we negotiate. That's destabilizing to the existing order, which is why Western powers pay such close attention to Chad's decision. It's not because Chad is economically dominant or militarily powerful. It's because Chad is a symbol. Chad represents the possibility that even nations at the heart of consensus-based institutions might decide those institutions no longer serve them. And if Chad can leave ECOWAS, others can too. Here's what makes Chad's decision so consequential in a specific way. Chad isn't Mali or Burkina Faso, nations that experienced military coups and then pivoted rapidly toward AES as a way of establishing legitimacy. Chad has maintained relatively stable civilian governance. It's not fleeing ECOWAS because it's in conflict with Western institutions. It's considering moving because the calculation of its national interests is shifting. Chad's leadership is asking, what does ECOWAS actually give us? Trade benefits? The evidence is mixed. Intra-ECOWAS trade hasn't expanded dramatically, and Chad remains far more integrated into regional economies outside ECOWAS, particularly with Central African neighbors, than with most ECOWAS members. Security cooperation? ECOWAS mechanisms for conflict resolution exist, but Chad's actual security partnerships often bypass ECOWAS entirely, involving bilateral arrangements with individual nations and sub-regional groupings. Economic development? ECOWAS hasn't delivered transformative growth or poverty reduction in ways that obviously benefit Chad compared to development Chad could pursue independently or within different regional arrangements. Meanwhile, AES offers something increasingly attractive: a coalition of nations making similar strategic calculations, pooling resources around African-led governance, and deliberately positioning itself to access resources and partnerships on better terms than ECOWAS offers. From Chad's perspective, it's not choosing between ECOWAS and isolation. It's choosing between two different regional partnerships, and increasingly, the AES calculation looks more advantageous. If Chad makes the move, the cascade becomes predictable but still shocking. Benin is geographically adjacent to both ECOWAS's core and to the Sahel, where AES dynamics dominate. Benin's leadership would face immediate internal pressure. If Chad moved, why shouldn't we reconsider? Togo, Guinea, and others would follow similar logic. Not all simultaneously, but over months and years. The decisions accumulate. Each departure makes the next one easier because it breaks the assumption that leaving ECOWAS is isolated or radical. It becomes normalized as nations recalibrate their relationships. The real earthquake comes if Senegal moves. Senegal is West Africa's democracy, its cultural center, a nation with genuine soft power in the region. If Senegal's leaders decided that AES offered better prospects than ECOWAS, it would represent a complete inversion of West Africa's power structure. Senegal isn't fighting Western influence through military coup or ideological revolution. Senegal is making a pragmatic, rational decision that AES better serves its interests. And if Senegal moves, Côte d'Ivoire can't afford to stay isolated within a diminished ECOWAS. An AES coalition that includes Chad, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and a cluster of other major economies becomes the default framework for West African cooperation. ECOWAS becomes a secondary institution or doesn't survive at all. That's the domino effect everyone's watching for. What's truly being contested here isn't just institutional arrangement. It's the future of Africa itself. For 500 years, the African continent's resources and policies have been shaped primarily by decisions made elsewhere. The brutality of colonialism, the mechanisms of neo-colonialism, the constraints of international institutions. All of these have meant that Africans have had limited control over Africa's trajectory. The post-colonial period brought independence, and the African Union and institutions like ECOWAS. These represented real progress. African nations exercising sovereignty, African leaders making decisions for their people. But that progress was partial and constrained. African nations could exercise sovereignty, but always within frameworks that limited their options, channeled their choices, and ensured that even when they made independent decisions, those decisions occurred within institutional structures designed by external powers. AES represents a break from even that constrained autonomy. It says, we don't just want the right to make decisions within existing institutions. We want to create institutions that serve African interests on African terms. We want partnerships based on mutual benefit, not hierarchical relationships. We want the right to pursue development models that work for us, not models imported from elsewhere. That's the ideology animating this moment. And Chad's decision becomes significant not because Chad is powerful or wealthy, but because Chad represents the moment when even moderate, stable nations begin accepting that ideology. If Chad can move, the shift becomes continental rather than marginal. Let's talk about something crucial that rarely enters mainstream discussion: resources. West Africa is resource-rich. Oil in Nigeria, Ghana, and others. Mineral wealth across the region. Agricultural potential. Timber. Fisheries. These resources are worth hundreds of billions annually. Currently, the extraction and benefit sharing of these resources operates within frameworks that, while ostensibly African-controlled, are heavily influenced by international corporations, international institutions, and Western governments that have established relationships and leverage over decades. If AES nations coordinate resource policy, if they demand higher royalties, require local processing, insist on technology transfer, build regional supply chains, the entire global resource economy could experience significant disruption. This isn't hypothetical. It's already beginning with energy policy. OPEC nations, many of them non-Western aligned, have demonstrated the power of resource coordination. Imagine if AES nations applied similar logic to minerals, timber, and agricultural products. Western nations are watching this possibility with deep concern, not because they oppose African development, but because African control of African resources at global market dominant prices would represent a massive shift in global wealth distribution. This is why the stakes around Chad's decision extend far beyond West African politics. Here's where it gets complicated for Western nations and institutions. They can't simply oppose AES or pressure nations not to join it. That would expose the exact dynamic AES is articulating, that Western institutions exist to serve Western interests, not African interests. The moment Western powers openly pressured African nations to stay in ECOWAS to maintain Western influence, they'd validate everything AES is saying. So instead, Western nations have to pretend that AES is the problem, that it's destabilizing, that partnerships with Russia and China are dangerous, that African nations are being manipulated. This framing has some validity. Partnership with new powers does introduce new complications, but it also misses the central point. African nations aren't choosing AES because they've been captured by Russia or China. They're choosing AES because they've concluded that existing institutions don't serve them.